Good morning, good afternoon. It's about time to start, 2 Eastern. I'm in Pacific time at 11. Thank you for joining us today. Our topic is questions about Torah and science. And the process I'd like to follow is to place some questions myself, which I've been asked over the years, and then provide a short answer, satisfying hopefully, but short. And then for those of you that are live, coming on live, you can ask me questions on the comments. When I say so, I can't keep up with the comments at the same time as I'm talking. I'm sorry, I'm not that multitasking. Hi to everybody that's saying hi. But after each of the questions I provide and the answers I give, I will allow people to ask a couple of questions, and then we'll move on to another topic and another topic for 45 minutes or so. If you have other questions that I don't answer while I'm live, please put them in the comments. I'll stay on after I'm done, and I'll try to answer your questions. These questions all came from audiences. Some came from teenagers. You'll probably recognize those. They're the hardest ones. And some came from adults. Typically relating to Torah and secular knowledge, mostly science, but sometimes just other kind of secular knowledge. So without further ado, I will pose a question like it was posed to me, and then I will provide a 3 or 4 minute answer to it, and take your questions on it and move on to the next one. So, the first question I normally get posed when we talk about Genesis, about creation, is, as to quote the question, how can there have been a Big Bang if God created the universe? So, as we're all aware, science has come up with a Big Bang theory to help explain how the universe came about naturally. So I guess that is the background to the question. If science has a natural explanation for how the universe came about, how can God have created the universe? So what I'd like to do is to tell you a little bit about the Big Bang theory, and then tell you a little bit about the Torah, and hopefully that will bring us to an answer on that issue. It turns out that the Big Bang theory is really good at telling us how the universe developed over time once it got started. But it doesn't say anything about the beginning. And that's not just my opinion, that's the scientific, everything I say about science comes from peer-reviewed science. I take science at complete face value, and I do the same with the Torah. So it turns out that once the universe gets started, the Big Bang theory is really good at telling us the kind of stars we should expect to see, and the kind of galaxies we should expect to see, and so on. But it says nothing about time zero. For example, the Big Bang doesn't say anything about where time came from. In fact, science doesn't know what time is. It doesn't have a good definition for time. The Big Bang doesn't say anything about where space came from. It doesn't say anywhere anything about the 17 elementary particles that make up the universe today that we've so far discovered. We know there's more to be discovered, but we discovered 17 so far. These particles have a mass, they have a charge, they have all kinds of properties. Big Bang says nothing about them. We just measure them. We measure them in experiments, and that's how we know about them. And the Big Bang says nothing about the forces. There are 4 forces in the universe, including gravity. Again, it doesn't say anything. Once you know all of these things, which are over 26 numbers, you can then run the Big Bang theory, which is nothing more than Einstein's equations, and it will recreate on the computer the universe that we see. So contrary to popular belief, the Big Bang theory does not explain how the universe came about or how it began. It explains that once it began, and once the forces of nature were whatever they are today, and once the particles were whatever they are today, and so on, then it explains how it all developed. To quote the most popular author on the subject, Brian Greene, which has the best-selling book, it says the Big Bang Theory delineates cosmic evolution from a split second after whatever happened to bring the universe into existence. But it says nothing about time zero itself. We are left rudderless in our question to understand the beginning of time. Well, he hasn't been reading Genesis. That's why he's left rudderless. We're not. So let's look at Genesis. Genesis, of course, posits that the universe had a beginning. Bereshit bara, in the beginning, God created. And by the way, it did this, of course, right from the beginning, whereas the Big Bang Theory is only since about the 1920s. Prior to the 1920s, most scientists believe in a different theory, which was that the universe was eternal and had no beginning. Only Genesis has maintained that the universe has had a beginning all along. So what the Torah tells us is that the universe had a beginning, and the word that is used in the Torah is the word bara, which means creation ex nihilo, creation out of nothing. Most of the acts in Genesis don't use that word. In English, it says like, let the waters teem, let the earth sprout vegetation. God said, let there be light. These are words which are translated in English as an act of making something, which means that I already have the ingredients and I make them into something else. There's only one bara, one ex nihilo creation for cosmology. There's another two baras for life. We'll probably touch them in other questions. But for cosmology, which is what we're talking about right now, the Big Bang, there's only one bara. It's right at the beginning. So what the Torah is saying is that there was a ex nihilo creation at the beginning. And when you look at the sources, that included the creation of time, the creation of space, the creation of all the building blocks to make the universe, what's called tohu in the second verse of Genesis, all the building blocks to create the universe. And once all those ingredients were there, present from the bara, every action that followed, the next one was let there be light, was using those ingredients to make new things like light and stars and the earth and so on. So the Torah is saying that science will be very successful in understanding that things came about naturally once the beginning was done, which was an ex nihilo, out of nothing creation. And that is exactly what the Big Bang Theory has discovered. There's a crisis in cosmology today because people just cannot figure out how everything got started. So the answer to the question is God created the universe out of nothing, but then it proceeded to develop in a way that would look to us naturally, because things were being made one from another under the natural laws, which of course God created. And therefore the Big Bang Theory will be very successful, except at the very beginning. So that's my short answer to that. I will pause for a minute and sorry, it's the first time I use Facebook, and I will look for comments from you. If you have a question that you want clarification, I will do that, and then we will go on to another question. I have a question here, but I don't have the source. I haven't seen this verse. In your light, we see light. From Jesse, I'm sorry. And Jesse, just before that, asked a question. If you want something in life, we have to ask God for it, not science. Certainly, science is a descriptive process where we can understand what a fossil looks like or how the sun works, but it doesn't tell us anything about the purpose of life or what we're here for. That's all we have to go to the Torah and to prayer to understand that. Okay, I'm not seeing any further questions, so I'm going to move on to the next topic, and we'll see how that goes. So one of the more popular questions these days, especially from young adults, is as follows. How can the Earth be the only place in the universe that has life with trillions of other galaxies and planets? out there. Of course, this is a popular topic these days. And let me, again, like we did before, start with the science of this and understand where the question is coming from, and then go on to the Torah of it, which is a little more controversial. So actually in science, I think if we did a poll of scientists, many would think that we do have life elsewhere. We're actually spending probably billions of dollars looking for life elsewhere. So the question assumes there is no life elsewhere, but science does assume there is life elsewhere. And why is that? Because science has a naturalistic theory of how life arose. We'll get to the Torah in a minute, but science has a naturalistic theory of how life arose. And it believes that life arose from inorganic materials, from rocks and dirt and so on. And it did so naturally. We have actually no even good proven mechanism for that to happen. So science just has this belief, but there is no proven mechanism for that to happen today. There is, none of them have worked out. They continue to be developed. Doesn't mean we won't find them, but so far none of them have been worked out. The other clear thing from the few theories that we have is that it's highly unlikely that a lot of very critical things had to happen. If there is a natural way for life to happen, a lot of things had to kind of be just right, what we would call like a perfect storm to make that happen. That's also true from science. So what does science posit? Science says, look, we think there's going to be a way for life. We're going to discover a way for life to develop naturally. We realize it's very unlikely, and a lot of things have to be just right. But look, there are billions of galaxies and stars, and now we think planets out there. So it's a bit like rolling dice. Of course, we have to roll like a million sixes in the dice game for life to occur. But look, there's billions of dice out there, and maybe it has happened naturally before. So that's what science is believing on. NASA and other space agencies are doing a lot of work building telescopes to look out there. In fact, we have detected light from planets, and we are able to dissect that light and see what kind of things are in their atmosphere. And we are seeing what people call exoplanets, which would be planets that would be presumably in some ways similar to Earth that might harbor life. However, it's clear that today's instruments are not going to give us the answers unless we get really lucky and just happen to point the telescope in the right place. But NASA is spending a lot of money, and in the 20s and 30s and 40s coming up in 20 years or so, we will have much more advanced satellites and telescopes, and we'll be able to look at a lot more planets. So that's the view of science. Now, what's the Torah view? Well, the Torah view is pretty clear from the simple reading of the Torah. God created everything. But as we saw in the previous question, there's two kinds of things that God did. God did a bara, which is a creation ex nihilo for some things. And for other things, he just worked with what had been done already. So we have to really look at the question of life now and see what was God doing. And the first time that we see life is in day 3, when it says, let the earth sprout vegetation. Now that is not a bara. That is the earth sprouting vegetation. The earth already has within it the power to sprout vegetation. That power was endowed on the earth, according to the commentaries and the sources, during the very first bara in day 1. When God created the earth, meaning at that point, the whole physical universe, the material on the earth, the dirt, that dirt was created endowed with the ability to grow plants. So when it says in day 3, let the earth sprout vegetation, that was what would seem to us a natural process, because it was already there and it happened. In fact, I think if we did a poll, most people think that when we get to Mars in 20 years or so, and we pour water on the soil and plant a seed, it'll grow. Now, that's a kind of a religious thought, really, because why should plants grow on Mars? It looks a little more hostile in the Negev, but it's different than the Negev. Plants grow in the Negev. But we all believe that plants are going to grow on Mars. The Torah is telling us yes. The Torah is telling us that the ability for Earth to grow plants is endowed by God at the beginning of day one. And if we plant plants in Mars, they'll probably grow. The question is, well, we're doing the planting. The question is, will they grow naturally in a Mars-like place? And I don't see anything in the Torah that says they won't, because the Earth was endowed with that capability. Of course, God made it happen on this planet at a particular time, in a particular sequence to bring us along. But the Earth is endowed with that capability, and that you could probably grow plants if enough time passed in some other place that had the right conditions. However, the Torah is crystal clear that when it gets to complex life, animals and humans, there are other baras required. So in day 5, when the complex animals in the ocean and the fish were made, that was a bara. That was not already existing. God brought something brand new into the process. And certainly when he made humans, that was also a bara in Genesis 1:26, I believe, that God brought something brand new into creation. So we cannot expect to find anything like humans or even dogs or complex animals anywhere else, because those things were done here on this planet on the latter days of creation. But we may find microscopic life in the waters, because that was not a bara, and plants elsewhere, according to the Torah. So at some level, the scientists believe that some things can happen naturally. Of course, they're not happening naturally. God set it up to happen, but it could happen more than once, and therefore we might see it in other planets. But anything like you or me or our favorite household pets, the Torah is saying, no, that was done right here. And in fact, we know that you cannot have humans without the Torah. And we know exactly where the Torah was given. It was given on Mount Sinai, not on Mars or anywhere else. It's only given once. And therefore, we will not expect to see any extraterrestrial life like that. So that's the answer to life in other planets. And I will pause here for a minute to see if you have any questions on that before I move to some of the other ones. I wish this was a little more interactive, but it is what it is. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions that at least I can answer. So I will continue. I'm going to do a little short one now. Favorite question from everybody has a short answer, I think. And that question is, how come dinosaurs are not mentioned in the Bible? This, of course, came from a teenage kid, which is fascinated with dinosaurs. Some people have come up with complex answers to this question, even claiming that dinosaurs are mentioned in the Bible, but I can't see the reference for that anywhere. The answer, I think, is quite short. The Bible is not a biology book. The Torah is a book about life, about how to live our lives. It does, of course, mention the natural world, in particular in Genesis, for a particular reason. So we could expect to ask this question. But, when we go into detail in Genesis, only 3 things are mentioned. When God is making the animals, he describes beasts and cattle and creeping beings. That's one of the English translations, but at least it's 3 things: beasts, cattle, and creeping beings. He doesn't talk about elephants or tigers or anything in Genesis. Later on in the Torah, it mentions over 100 animals. But these animals are mentioned in the context of either stories, like a donkey, or more specifically, relating to sacrifices in the temple. And of course, for our kosher laws of eating and slaughtering. So these are practical mentions of animals for our everyday life, and of course they relate to humans, and we don't eat dinosaurs because they didn't exist when we existed. So we cannot expect the Torah, which is really a manual for our life, to be mentioning these kind of details, and it doesn't. There's millions of species. It only mentions about 100 of them, and it's very focused on our sacrifices at the temple and what we eat and what we shouldn't eat, and so on. So that's why I believe dinosaurs and a whole raft of another million species are not mentioned in the Torah. I'll pause for a minute here. That was a short one. I got a harder and longer one coming up. See if there's any questions on that. Again, use the chat if you want to ask me a question, please. I'm not looking at it all the time, but anytime I pause, I'm looking at it. Okay, so we talked a little bit about cosmology. We talked a little bit about animal life. And I must say that most of the questions that I get when I talk is about humans. I guess we're more interested in humans than anything else, which is quite natural. And here's an interesting question for both scientists and the Torah that has been posted. If there was only Adam and Eve in the beginning, how can there be different races such as Chinese and African Americans? And that's a very good question, because both science and the Bible believe we come from an original. In science, we believe we come from one place. That humans only, in their view, evolved once, not many times, but once. And of course, in the Torah, as we'll go into in a minute, we come from Adam and Eve. So how do we end up with all these different? I don't think racist is the politically correct word anymore, but how do we end up with all these different looking people around the world? So what we have observed scientifically is that people living in the same geographic area for a long time show similarities in characteristics such as size, shape, skin color, hair form, and even invisible characteristics such as the type of blood that they have. Some of these groups are fairly large, like the Native Americans before we came to America from Europe and kind of mixed things up. And some of the African populations are very large, and some of them are quite small. You can find them in the Brazilian jungle, fairly distinct populations of smaller groups of people. So that's just what we observe. And the scientific explanation for that, which is very well developed, is that when you put a bunch of people in a fairly isolated geographic area, two things happen. First of all, before air travel and before COVID, or now after COVID, without air travel, these populations were quite separate. There wasn't a lot of movement between populations. And therefore, the breeding was all within that population. We certainly know that from Eastern European Jews. We have a very specific DNA markers and unfortunately some specific diseases and so on, and also some physical characteristics as we were together for a long time and we bred within ourselves for a long time. This has happened in many places in the world with many different populations. And as you recycle that genetic material, you end up with these characteristics. And as you live in the particular geographic location with less sun or more sun or different kinds of naturally grown foods there, you end up looking different. This is a scientific fact. We can't simulate it on humans, but we can simulate it on other species. You're thinking, well, he's talking about evolution. Well, I'm not talking about evolution in a Darwinian macroevolutions where new species are created. I'm just talking about within a particular kind, as the Torah would say, we humans, within humans, we're not developing different humans. We're just developing darker humans or taller humans or so on. You'll see in a minute that the Torah actually says that explicitly. And science does too. So that's how you end up with these different populations of taller or darker people from a scientific basis. Now, what does the Torah have to say about all this? Well, as you know, the Torah says that we came from Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve had Cain and Abel. Actually, it had Cain and Abel plus 3 sisters. So each of there were 3 twin sisters born to them, and that's how the world began to be populated. This is derived directly from the text in Genesis, but obviously contained in other sources. So Cain and Abel and their sisters began to populate the world, and Adam had more children, of course, later had Seth and many other children, and so on, and the world began to be populated. And then the flood came, and everything was wiped out. And at that point, we start from Noah's 3 sons and their wives. So we start with 6 people, and start to repopulate the world from that. So although the timing and the details are different from science and the Torah agree that there's only one set of humans. There's only one living species or kind of human. Now, what does the Torah say about the fact that we have different looking humans everywhere? Well, the Rebbe said very explicitly in one of his letters that there's nothing in the Torah that denies the possibility of evolution within a particular species through various mutations. So, of course, in the Torah, God creates each kind separately, and certainly humans separately, but then we can vary in there. In fact, if you go to the Talmud, there's a dialogue where Hillel is questioned, and I'll read it to you. The man asked, "Why do Africans have wide feet?" Hillel said to him, "You have asked a significant question. The reason is because they live in marshlands and their feet widened to enable them to walk through those swampy areas." So he's basically describing variation here. In fact, I looked this up, and the scientific studies have been done today, and Africans do have wider feet. I don't know if it's because they live in marshlands from a scientific perspective, but they do. So in short, the answer to the question is you can start from a very limited population, both scientifically and in the Torah, it's explicitly said, and generate quite a variety of different traits, both visible and invisible in people. This is true in animals too, by the way, because of the way the groups they breathe with and the places they live, and that is explicitly mentioned in the Talmud. I'll pause here for a couple of minutes, see if there's any questions on that, whether that's clear or not, and we'll go from there. Okay, I'm not seeing anything in the comment line. I am gonna now move on to a question that turns out to be quite related to the virus that's plaguing us right now. So I want to make sure I do get through that question before other ones, because it's kind of topical to today. At first, it doesn't seem to be related to the virus, but you'll see in a minute it is. And here's the question. As you know, we're in the Jewish year 5780, and that year is counted from the birthday of Adam, from day 6. So about a little under 6,000 years have elapsed since creation, a couple hundred years less. So the question goes as follows. If you go back 5,800 years and people have the, quote, normal number of children, could we have the current population? In other words, can you start with Adam and Eve, or actually, as I just said now, after the flood with the sons of Noah, and end up, given the biblical timeline of thousands of years, end up with a population of almost 8 billion people today? That is the question. And population growth is exactly the way viruses multiply. And in fact, we have been trying to flatten the curve of population by slowing the rate the rate at which people have children. For example, in China and India, where the population mushroomed to almost a billion people very, very quickly, and then they introduce actually laws in the case of China to flatten the curve and bring the population growth down by having less babies. So that's exactly what we're trying to do with the virus. If we leave it unchecked, it just takes off. But the question is, what kind of numbers can you get to? So it turns out that in science, people have tried very hard to figure out how the population of humans developed over time. We only have good data from 1850 on, just the last 200 years. And in 1850, the population of the world was about 1.2 billion people. And from 1850 to 2019, which is the last data I have, we grew to 7.5 billion. So in 200 years, we went from 1 billion to 7 billion, give or take. That's well documented. We understand that well. We believe that in that period, there was the highest population growth that there's ever been. And that's because until recently anyway, people were having quite a few children. Of course, population growth depends on how many children you have, but it also depends very heavily on how many people die. And as medicine and healthcare improved after the 1800s, the mortality rate of newborns went down. And of course, our lifespans have steadily increased about 10 years. So because that happened, we've had a very, very fast population growth rate. In fact, it peaked in the early 1900s before contraceptives got more popular. And we were growing our population by leaps and bounds. And that's how we ended up with billions of people. Today, the population growth is quite low in the world at large. Of course, there are pockets that are growing more, but in the world at large is quite low. So when people try to estimate what the population looked like before 1850 in science, it's very difficult. They have to guess at what was going on, what kind of famines, what kind of groups of people were they, where they lived. And it's really a guessing game. Science has done that and believes that on a certain rate of population growth from a long time ago, because of course, from a scientific perspective, the theory is that humans have been around for 100,000 years or so. And they come up with their growth rates, and they end up at 1.2 billion in 1850. However, the interesting thing is that if you vary that growth rate a little tiny bit, like a fraction of a percent, that population growth is quite a bit higher. And that's just the nature of exponential growth that we've seen with the virus, unfortunately. So if we go to the Torah is very clear. We start with Adam and Eve, as I spoke earlier. We get to the flood. Everybody perishes. We start with 6 people, Noah and Noah's 3 sons and his wives. And God tells him to go out and repopulate the world. And that is roughly in the year, well, not roughly, exactly in the year 2105 before the Common Era. So about 4,000 years ago is when the flood happened, and when the world, according to the Torah, began to be repopulated. So we have 4,000 years, give or take, to get to 1850 and take those 6 people into 1.2 billion. And so the answer from this teenager was, well, is that possible? So let me give you some numbers. The highest population growth rate ever recorded in history was 2% per year, 2.3% per year in the mid-1900s. That's when people were still having 6, 7, 8 kids. The whole world was doing that, not just our Orthodox Jews and a few others, but the whole world was having that. And medicine was such that the kids were surviving and the parents were living a long time, and they were grandparents and so on. And we grew at 2.3%. That only happened for a few years in our whole recorded history. But if that had happened for 4,000 years, today, if we started just with Noah's sons and his wives, today we would have a 1 followed by 33 zeros number of people. I don't even know what that number is. On the other hand, if the whole 4,000 years we have had the population growth rate that's happening in the United States right now, which is 0.4%, the world would only have 57 million people. So that gives you the bounds. The highest population growth would produce, for all intents and purposes, an impossible number of people. And the current population growth of not of the world, of the United States, which is one of the lowest, would produce only 57 million people, not billions. So it turns out that if you have a population growth rate of about 0.5%, you can generate the number of people from just 6 that's required to populate the world today. It's totally feasible. Science believes that that number was lower than 0.5%, but the margin of error is huge. And we certainly have experienced 0.5%. We are experiencing 0.5% right now. In fact, Brazil is currently growing its population at 0.67%. So those kinds of rates are completely feasible, and one can completely explain that you could get to billions of people from the flood to today. And that's that topic. I hope that's clear. It's a little bit of math there, but you can see why we're so desperately trying to flatten that curve, which in our case means to not let that virus have babies by infecting more people. And you can see that by changing the rate from 0.5% to 2%, you go from millions in population to trillions and trillions. Of course, the virus reproduces a lot faster than 9 months, and that's our problem. Any questions on that on the chat line before I think I'll do one more question to make sure we're under the 45 minutes? Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions. I'll do another reasonably short one, but it comes up quite often, and it's hard to find an answer to it. I had to search hard for it. And that is maybe not a science question, more of a Torah question only, but the question is, how can people in Genesis have lived hundreds of years? You will recall that, here's a question. Let me stop for a minute. Okay, good question from William here. If we're all descendants of Adam and Eve, does that not make us all Jews? And someone asked me recently, are we not basically inbred, for the lack of a politically correct expression? I actually have a whole question and answer on this. Maybe I'll do it at a future time, but I'll give you the short version. We are all this, the Torah is crystal clear. We are all descendants of Adam and Eve. We're all one family. I'll get to the inbred in a minute. But that does not make us all Jews. Because unfortunately, Adam sinned and Eve sinned. And then we went through the whole question. And it was only Abraham that 2,000 years later recognized that there was a one God. And eventually, God chose one people to give the Torah to, and those were the descendants of Jacob. And that's us Jews. So we're all one set of people. The Torah, in terms of the 7 Noahide laws, applies to all people on earth. That's why the Rebbe pushed the 7 Noahide laws very, very hard. But as Jews, we were given not 7, but 613. Because we have a different job in this world, to be a light to all nations. Doesn't make us better, we just have a different job. If you're a doctor, you got to study for 6 years. If you're an engineer, you got to study for 4 years, and so on. So we all have different jobs. So no, we're not all Jews. We're all humans, descendants from Adam. And Jacob and his descendants became the Jews. As you know, Abraham had more than the Jewish descendants. With Esau and Ishmael and so on. Ishmael from Abraham and Esau from Isaac. So that's that. Now, are we basically not all inbred? And this is a very good question, quite a long answer to it, but scientific studies have been made on both animals and humans that have survived in a limited place catastrophes and had to recover the population from maybe 60 or 70 people. This happens to indigenous groups in the past and even today in the Amazon and other places where there's a massive flood or something and a big chunk of the population is wiped out, and then it recovers from just a few people, not from 5 or 6, but from dozens. And the answer is that populations can recover from a very few number of people. Of course, there are defects. I'm talking science now. I'll get to Torah in a minute. Of course, there are defects, but there are healthy babies, and if the healthy babies mate with the healthy babies, eventually you do end up with a healthy population. It might have 10% of the population have defects instead of a fraction of a percent as we do today, but the population can recover from a quote unquote inbred situation. And in the future, I might do that question in more detail. Now, the Torah is a little bit different. In the Torah, we start with very few people, but God is in charge. And we're specifically told in the case of Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel and their sisters who they married, that God did a hesed to us, a kindness to us, and he made it such that they could have kids without having the inbreeding problems that we see today. So it is possible for it to happen naturally, but in the case of the Torah, we're told that God made a kindness so it wouldn't happen. So I hope that answers the question. I have another one here. So this question goes back to a much earlier question, which it says that God explains, even if the creation by God explains how the Big Bang started, why is the world 5780 years old? Scientists say that it took billions of years for the Big Bang to happen. That is a big question. I didn't cover it today because I have a video on JLI Facebook. If you Google my name, you will see a video answering this question. And the short answer is that the numbers can be compatible, and that there are certain Jewish sources that say that the days were long periods of time, and that's one way you can do it compatible, and there's books on that. However, my talk doesn't say that because I follow the Rever's opinion and the opinion of the majority of our commentators that say that the 6 days were actually real 24-hour days like our days, and that the world is 578 years old, despite the fact that science says it's billions of years old. And the way that's dealt with is that science makes the assumption that everything happened naturally. So when science studies the age of the sun, it says, well, the sun is made out of hydrogen and helium, and we know kind of the quantities of hydrogen and helium that are floating around in space, and we can measure how much hydrogen and helium is in the sun today, and there's more helium in the sun today than there is in space, and we know that what happens is hydrogen turns to helium through nuclear fusion, and we know exactly how long that takes. So if the sun came about naturally from whatever's out there, it would have taken 4.5 billion years to develop. And that's a reasonable argument, and it's a correct argument. The math is correct, but the assumption may not be correct. The sun may not have come about naturally. The Torah says very clearly that things did not come about naturally. The Talmud tells us that things were made in their full glory, in their full functional mode. That's what, and it was good means. Rashi explains every time it says it was good in the Torah, it says it reached its intended purpose. So Adam was made as a 20-year-old. The Torah would argue that the sun was made functional, ready to go. We all know science agrees that the sun was not functional in their theory 4.5 billion years ago. It didn't do what was required for us to live on Earth. It only does it more recently. The Torah says that God made the sun finished. So in short, the Torah says it's 5780 years old, and everything was made ready to use. Science tries to figure out a natural explanation how things came about. And if it did come about that, then it would have taken a long time. And that's kind of how you correlate these two worldviews. Okay, I think we're running out of time to do more questions. I have about 20 or so more questions. And if you have questions like these, I would be very, very thankful if you put them in the chat line or found me on Facebook and send them to me, because I am putting a question and answer book together. I'm up to about 25 of these questions, and I'm looking for more questions for my book. So I will be selfish and ask you to send me questions. I promise to try and answer them if I know the answer. If I don't know the answer, I'll let you know. If I can't research it out and figure it out. If you want more information or to go in more depth in many of these questions, I have a number of Torah science books out there. You can see them on Facebook. Just put in my name, not on Facebook, on Amazon. Put in my name on Amazon, you'll see them. And as I said, there's about 8 3 or 4 minute videos on Facebook, JLI Facebook, on questions I did not cover today because the videos are there. I'd like to thank you very much for attending. If you like this, please share it with others. And that way I can come back and answer some more questions. And thank you so much for your questions as we went along. That always keeps things a little more interactive in these days where we're all isolated. Thank you very much and have a good day.